Queen Elizabeth I was considered fastidious because she bathed once a month, but her cleanliness was largely a matter of paint. To achieve the pale, ghostly look that was in fashion, she used Venetian cerus, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. This wasn't washed off at night, it was layered. Each morning, a new layer of white lead paint was applied over the old one, trapping the dirt, sweat, and bacteria against her skin for weeks. This led to lead poisoning that literally ate away at the skin, creating craters and sores that were, ironically, covered up with even more clean white paint. But the most intimate part of royal hygiene was the groom of the stool. This was one of the most prestigious and powerful positions in the English court. The groom's job was to assist the king in his most private moments, specifically the use of the close stool, the royal toilet. This servant was responsible for monitoring the king's output for signs of illness and then cleaning the royal backside with pieces of expensive linen or towel. Because they were with the king in his most vulnerable state, the groom of the stool often became his closest confidant and a powerful political advisor. In the world of the royals, even the most basic act of hygiene was a high-stakes political event. As the 18th century ended, the royal stench became a symbol of a decaying aristocracy. When the French Revolution broke out, the cleanliness of the revolutionaries, who embraced the cold, honest water of the people, was contrasted with the perfumed filth of the palace. The era of the unwashed king was over. The world was moving toward a new ideal, a leader who didn't just look clean under a layer of powder, but who was actually physically scrubbed.
For the average soldier throughout history, the enemy wasn't just the man across the field with a bayonet, it was the very ground he stood on. From the mud-choked fields of the Napoleonic Wars to the bloody trenches of the American Civil War, the front line was a place where hygiene went to die. If you were a soldier in 1860, you weren't worried about smelling like roses, you were worried about the slow rot, a terrifying combination of filth, dampness, and parasites that claimed more lives than bullets ever did. In the encampments of the 19th century, soap was often a casualty of war. Supply lines were shaky, and food always took priority over cleaning supplies. This led to a phenomenon known as the Great Itch. Without soap or fresh water to wash their uniforms, soldiers became walking ecosystems for body lice, which they nicknamed graybacks. These insects lived in the seams of their wool coats, and the only way to find relief was the ritual of skirmishing. Every night, groups of soldiers would sit around the campfire, stripped to the waist, using the heat of the flame or their thumbnails to skirmish, or crack and kill, the lice eggs in their clothes. It was a bonding ritual born of absolute misery. But the real killer was the feet. Before the invention of moisture-wicking socks and waterproof boots, soldiers marched for weeks in damp, heavy leather. Without the ability to wash and dry their feet, they fell victim to trench foot. The skin would turn red, then blue, and eventually begin to slough off in chunks as it literally rotted while the soldier was still alive. To combat this, some officers ordered their men to rub their feet with whale oil or animal lard. The grease acted as a primitive waterproof barrier, sealing the skin away from the mud. It smelled like a rendering plant, but that layer of fat was often the only thing standing between a soldier and an amputation. On the battlefield, surgical hygiene was a concept of the future. Surgeons would move from one soldier to the next, wiping their blood-stained hands on their aprons and using the same unwashed bone saw for a dozen amputations. They believed that laudable pus, the thick yellow discharge from a wound, was a sign of healing. In reality, it was a sign of rampant infection. The soldiers themselves would often try to clean their wounds with spunk or rotten wood or whatever rags they had, unknowingly packing their injuries with billions of bacteria. The turning point came with the realization that laundry was a weapon. During the American Civil War, nurses like Clara Barton realized that cleanliness wasn't about the individual, it was about the environment. They began to demand boiling vats for the soldiers' linens.
They realized that boiling the blood and sweat out of bandages and shirts killed the monsters they couldn't see. Suddenly, the most important soldier in the camp wasn't the one with the gun. It was the one tending the massive steaming kettles of lye and water. This era proved that when humans are pushed to the edge, hygiene becomes a matter of tactical survival. A clean soldier was a mobile soldier. By the time the world entered the 20th century, the military hygiene kit, complete with a razor, a hard bar of soap, and foot powder, became as essential as ammunition. We learned the hard way that you can win 1,000 battles, but if you don't have the tools to wash the mud off your skin, the earth will eventually take you back.
While the body was often neglected, the head was where historical hygiene turned truly bizarre. For centuries, hair was treated more like a construction project than a part of the human body. Because washing hair with water was a labor-intensive nightmare that could take a whole day to dry, people looked for ways to set and forget their hairstyles. This led to a period of history where the hair on someone's head was often the dirtiest, most dangerous thing about them. In the 18th century, the height of fashion was the pouf. These were the towering, elaborate hairstyles seen in the court of Marie Antoinette. To achieve this height, women didn't just use their own hair, they used rats, or pads of matted hair, and wire frames. To keep everything in place, they used a pomatum made of mutton tallow or lard. Yes, women were essentially styling their hair with animal fat. To hide the smell of the grease and to achieve the trendy white look, they would then dump pounds of wheat flour or starch over their heads. The problem with a head full of lard and flour is that it becomes a mobile buffet for pests. Historical accounts reveal that these towers of hair became literal living nests for mice and cockroaches. Because the hairstyles were so expensive and difficult to create, women would keep them up for weeks at a time. They would sleep with their necks balanced on wooden neck rests to avoid crushing the pouf. To deal with the inevitable itching of insects crawling inside the grease and flour mixture, they used those long silver wig scratchers we mentioned earlier. Some even wore nightcaps made of wire mesh to keep the rats from nesting in their hair while they slept. But the horror didn't stop at the styling, it was in the color. If you weren't satisfied with your natural shade, the pre-soap world offered terrifying solutions. To go blonde, Romans used a mixture of goat fat and beechwood ash, which was so caustic it often caused the hair to fall out in clumps. By the Renaissance, clean hair was often achieved by using lead-based dyes. People would comb their hair with lead combs or apply Egyptian ointments containing lead ore to darken gray hairs. Over time, the lead would be absorbed through the scalp, leading to the vapors, or depression, tremors, and madness, all in the pursuit of a fashionable look. For those who couldn't afford wigs or lead dyes, hair wash was a pungent affair. One popular recipe for shiny hair involved rosemary steeped in stale urine or a mixture of egg whites and rum. The egg whites would dry and crack off, taking the surface dirt with them, while the rum acted as a degreaser. It was effective, but it left the person smelling like a distillery in a barnyard. The invention of modern shampoo only happened in the late 19th century, and even then it was just a specialized form of soap. It wasn't until the 1930s that synthetic pH-balanced liquids were invented. Before that, every time you washed your hair, you were essentially performing a chemistry experiment on your scalp. We moved from the era of lard and mice to the era of sulfates and silicones, but looking back, it's a miracle our ancestors had any hair left at all.
If you think the great stink of the body was bad, imagine the state of the human mouth before the 20th century. For most of history, dental hygiene was a luxury that often felt more like a torture session. While we now reach for a soft, nylon-bristled brush and minty paste, our ancestors were sticking everything from frayed twigs to the stiff neck hairs of wild boars into their mouths to keep the toothworms at bay. The earliest toothbrushes weren't brushes at all, but chew sticks. Found in Babylonian and Egyptian tombs dating back to 3500 BC, these were simple twigs with one end frayed into a fan of fibers. In the Middle East and Africa, the miswak tree was the gold standard. It was a natural miracle. The wood contained its own fluoride, silica, and antibacterial resins. You didn't need toothpaste. The stick was the toothpaste. To the ancient world, a person with a miswak stick was seen as refined, while a person with mossy teeth was a social outcast. However, as we move into Europe's age of grime, dental care took a dark turn. By the 1700s, the miswak was forgotten in the West, replaced by the linen scrub. A wealthy person would take a piece of rough linen cloth, dip it in a mixture of soot, ground pumice, or crushed seashells, and rub it vigorously against their teeth. It was essentially sandpapering the enamel. If you were truly desperate, you might use salt and vinegar, a combination that killed bacteria, but also slowly dissolved your teeth until they were nothing but jagged, yellow stumps. The first modern toothbrush was born in a prison cell. In 1770, an Englishman named William Addis was serving time for starting a riot. Tired of using a dirty rag with soot to clean his teeth, he saved a small animal bone from his dinner. He bored tiny holes into the bone, tied together bundles of stiff boar hair he had bargained from a guard, and glued them into the holes. When he was released, he became the first mass producer of toothbrushes. But there was a disgusting catch: the bristles. Boar hair is hollow, meaning it trapped moisture and bacteria inside the brush. Because these brushes were expensive, families would often share a single communal boar hair brush. By the second or third person, the brush wasn't cleaning teeth. It was a mobile colony of germs. Furthermore, the bristles were so stiff they would often cause the gums to bleed, leading to infections that were sometimes more dangerous than the cavities themselves. As for toothpaste, the Victorian era offered some stomach-turning recipes. Before the invention of the collapsible tube in the 1890s, tooth soap came in a hard ceramic pot. You would rub your wet, bacteria-laden boar brush onto the paste and scrub. Ingredients often included charcoal, honey, and even dragon's blood, a bright red plant resin. Some people even used burnt bread or brick dust to get that sparkling white look. They didn't care about cavity protection. They cared about the aesthetics of a white smile in an age where teeth were expected to rot by age 30. It wasn't until 1938 that DuPont invented nylon, finally replacing animal hair with synthetic bristles that didn't rot. We moved from the era of chewing on twigs and scrubbing with soot to the high-tech sonic vibrating world of today. But the next time you brush your teeth, remember the boar hair era, and be thankful you aren't sharing a hollow bristle brush with your entire neighborhood.
In the pre-soap world, smell was the ultimate indicator of class, health, and morality. Because deep cleaning was so difficult, the world didn't smell like nothing, it smelled like everything all at once. To walk through a city like London or Paris in 1750 was to be assaulted by a symphony of rot, open sewers, horse manure, boiling fat from candle makers, and the unwashed bodies of thousands. To survive this, the wealthy didn't try to remove the smell, they tried to conquer it with a perfumed mask. This led to the invention of the pomander. If you look at portraits of Renaissance nobles, you'll often see them clutching a small, ornate metal ball hanging from their belt or held to their nose. This was the frontline defense against the world. Inside the gold or silver filigree was a wax ball made of ambergris, whale vomit, musk from deer glands, civet, and dried flowers. They believed in miasma theory, that bad smells actually carried diseases. By holding a pomander to their nose, they weren't just being snobs, they literally thought they were filtering out the plague. But the perfume industry of this era was far more animal than it is today. To make a scent stick to a body that hadn't been washed with soap, you needed fixatives. The most popular scents were heavy, greasy, and incredibly potent. Musk, castoreum from beavers, and ambergris were used because they were oily and would bond to the natural oils on human skin. Instead of a light spray of floral water, people would rub thick scented pomades into their skin and hair.
As the 18th century reached its peak, the perfumed mask became absurd. The French court of Louis XV was known as la cour parfumée, the perfumed court. Every day a different scent was ordered for the palace, not just for people, but for the furniture, the fans, and even the fountains. They were trying to create a bubble of artificial scent to block out the reality of a palace that still lacked basic plumbing. For those who couldn't afford whale vomit and deer musk, there were posies and tussie-mussies. These were small handheld bouquets of fragrant herbs like rosemary, thyme, and lavender. In a crowded theater or a church, people would constantly sniff their flowers to avoid fainting from the human vapor of the crowd. Even judges in English courts carried bouquets of sweet herbs to protect themselves from the jail fever, typhus, wafting off the prisoners in the dock. The perfumed mask era only ended when soap became a surfactant, a chemical that could actually remove the oils that held on to smells. Once we could wash away the grease, we no longer needed to bury it under a pound of musk. We moved from a world that smelled like perfumed decay to a world that smells like synthetic citrus. We traded the complexity of the pomander for the simplicity of the shower. But for over 1,000 years, a pocketful of dried flowers was the only thing that made the world bearable.
If you think doing laundry is a chore today, imagine a world where a single load of clothes took 3 full days of grueling physical combat. Before the washing machine, Laundry Day was the most feared event of the week, usually falling on a Monday. For centuries, a woman's social standing and the health of her family depended on her ability to perform a chemical and mechanical miracle using nothing but boiling water, caustic chemicals, and her own muscle. The process began with the soak. On Sunday night, clothes were sorted and placed in massive wooden tubs. But they weren't just soaking in water. To break down the deep-seated grease and body linen oils, they used lye water, or, in many poorer households, stale urine. The ammonia in the urine acted as a bleaching agent. If you were a traveler in the 1700s, the smell of clean laundry wasn't the scent of mountain spring. It was the sharp, stilling odor of fermented ammonia. On Monday morning, the real violence started. This was the rubbing and beating phase. Women would stand over steaming tubs for hours, scrubbing fabric against a washboard, which, before it was made of metal, was often just a ridged piece of wood. For heavy items like bed sheets or wool coats, they used a dolly or a bat staff, a heavy wooden club used to pound the clothes against a stone or the bottom of the tub. This was designed to force the water through the fibers, to blast the dirt out. It was so physically demanding that laundry arms, thick, muscular forearms, were a common trait among working-class women. Then came the boil. The clothes were moved to a massive copper kettle over a coal fire. This was the only way to kill the lice and bacteria that soap couldn't reach. To get the whites whiter than white, they used a strange trick, the bluing. They added a tiny amount of blue pigment, usually indigo or cobalt, to the water. This didn't actually clean the clothes, it was an optical illusion. The blue tint neutralized the yellowing of the fabric, making it appear dazzlingly white to the human eye. The final stage was the wringing and mangle. Getting the water out of heavy linen was nearly impossible by hand. They used a mangle, 2 heavy wooden rollers turned by a crank. This was the most dangerous part of the job. If a finger got caught in the rollers, it would be crushed instantly. Once pressed, the clothes were hauled outside. If it was winter, the clothes would often freeze solid on the line, looking like ghosts standing in the yard. They would have to be brought inside to thaw and dry by the fire, filling the house with a damp, soapy mist that lasted for days. This staggering amount of labor is why people owned so few clothes. A person might have 2 sets of underwear and 1 outer coat for their entire life. You didn't wash your clothes because they smelled. You washed them because they had become so stiff with dirt and salt that they were physically uncomfortable to wear.
When we look at the history of soap, we must also look at the history of the hands that used it, the millions of women whose lives were defined by the endless cycle of the tub, the fire, and the mangle.
During the Great Plagues that decimated Europe, hygiene wasn't about looking good. It was a frantic, terrifying battle for survival. But because our ancestors didn't know about bacteria or viruses, they focused their cleaning efforts on the wrong thing entirely, the smell. They believed in miasma, the idea that the plague was a sentient bad air that traveled through the streets like a fog. To stay clean during a plague outbreak, you didn't wash your hands, you tried to scrub the atmosphere. The most iconic image of this era is the plague doctor. These figures were the ultimate hygiene warriors of the 17th century. They wore a long leather coat coated in wax to prevent miasma from sticking to their clothes, and a mask with a long bird-like beak. This beak wasn't for fashion, it was a primitive air filter. It was stuffed with clean substances, dried flowers, camphor, mint, and cloves. They believed that if they could only smell the herbs instead of the stench of the sick, they would remain pure and untouched by the disease. In the streets, the cleaning was even more dramatic. Cities like London and Marseille would order massive bonfires to be lit on every street corner. They burned aromatic woods like cedar and pine, and sometimes even sulfur or tar. The goal was to burn the air clean. Imagine the scene, the sky blackened by thick, choking smoke, the air tasting of resin and chemicals, while citizens walked around with sponges soaked in vinegar pressed to their faces. They weren't cleaning the filth on the ground, they were trying to fumigate the entire world. Inside the home, hygiene turned into a ritual of acid and fire. People believed that letters and money carried the plague, so they wouldn't touch them with bare hands. Mail was sanitized by being held over a fire or dipped in vinegar, a practice called disinfection that actually worked, though for the wrong reasons. They would scrub their floors with 4 thieves' vinegar, a legendary concoction of herbs that was supposedly used by grave robbers to keep themselves safe while they looted the bodies of plague victims. Yet while they were busy perfuming their air and vinegaring their coins, they were ignoring the real culprits, the fleas and the rats living in the very filth they refused to wash away with soap. Because they were so afraid that water would open their pores and let the miasma in, they stayed as dry and perfumed as possible. It was a tragic irony. The more they tried to stay clean by avoiding water and using heavy scents, the more they provided a perfect, undisturbed habitat for the parasites that were actually killing them. The plague era was the ultimate test of human hygiene, and it was a test we failed for centuries. It wasn't until the sanitary revolution of the 1800s that we realized that bad air wasn't the enemy. It was the invisible microbes in the water and the dirt. We moved from the era of smoke and vinegar to the era of chlorine and soap, finally learning that true cleanliness isn't something you smell. It's something you achieve at the microscopic level. For thousands of years, if you wanted a shower, you had to stand under a waterfall or have a servant pour a bucket of water over your head. The idea of a mechanical device that rained water down on you was a pipe dream until the mid-18th century. But the first versions of this modern luxury were less spa day and more survival challenge. The first mechanical shower, patented in 1767 by an Englishman named William Feetham, was known as the vane shower. It was a bizarre, vertical wooden contraption. You would stand in a basin, and a series of hand pumps would pull water from the bottom of the tank to a bucket suspended over your head. When you pulled a string, the bucket tipped. The catch? You were using the same water over and over again. As you washed the soot and grime off your body, the water in the basin became a gray, soapy sludge, which you then pumped back up to rain down on yourself again. It was a closed-loop system of filth. By the Victorian era, the shower had evolved into a medical device.
Doctors believed that a sudden shock of cold water could cure everything from hysteria to sluggishness of the mind. This led to the creation of the penny in the slot shower and the terrifying English Regency shower. This massive, ornate iron frame looked like a bird cage. It featured a dizzying array of pipes that didn't just spray you from above, but also from the sides, the needle spray, and even from below. It was designed to hit every square inch of the body with high-pressure, freezing water. The problem, as always, was plumbing. Until the late 1800s, most of these showers were located in the basement or outside because a house's upper floors couldn't support the weight of the tanks. Furthermore, there was no way to heat the water. Taking a shower was an act of extreme bravery, a literal cold plunge that would leave you shivering for hours. The true revolution happened in the 1880s thanks to the military. The Prussian army realized that bathing thousands of soldiers in tubs was too slow and used too much water. They developed the group shower, a series of overhead nozzles that could wash a whole company of men in minutes. This proved so efficient that schools, prisons, and eventually luxury hotels began to adopt the technology. But it wasn't until the 1920s, with the rise of the standard bathroom, that the shower finally beat the bathtub. As the pace of life accelerated, people didn't have an hour to soak in a copper tub. The shower was the efficiency engine of the modern age. It allowed the working man to blast off the factory soot and the office worker to wake up his brain before a commute. We moved from Fetham's bucket of recycled gray water to the rainfall heads and smart showers of today. We no longer use them to shock our nerves or cure hysteria. We use them as our final sanctuary of privacy. But the next time you step into a warm, steaming shower, remember, you're using a device that started out as a way to dump a bucket of cold, dirty water on an eccentric Englishman's head.
If the shower is the sanctuary of the modern bathroom, the toilet is its engine. But for the vast majority of human history, the act of going was a public, messy, and often dangerous affair. We take the flush for granted, but the journey from a hole in the ground to the high-tech, heated seat marvels of today is paved with social awkwardness and some truly stomach-turning solutions. In the ancient world, privacy was a foreign concept. The Romans were famous for their public latrines, long stone benches with holes cut in them, where dozens of citizens would sit by side, chatting about politics or the weather while they did their business. But the real horror wasn't the lack of walls, it was the xylospongium. Instead of toilet paper, the Romans used a sea sponge tied to a wooden stick. And here's the kicker, it was communal. After use, you would rinse the sponge in a channel of running water at your feet and leave it in a bucket of vinegar for the next person. When the Roman Empire fell, hygiene fell with it. During the Middle Ages, the garderobe became the standard for castles. This was a tiny stone room built into the castle wall with a hole that dropped everything directly into the moat below. While this kept the smell out of the bedroom, it made the castle walls incredibly slippery and foul-smelling. In the cities, people used chamber pots, which were famously emptied out of windows into the street with a warning cry of "Gardez-vous," from the French "Gare l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water." The first true flush didn't arrive until 1596, when Sir John Harington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, invented the Ajax. It featured a water tank and a valve to wash away waste. However, the Queen's court mocked him for it, and the invention was largely forgotten for 200 years. The world wasn't ready to bring the stink inside the house. It wasn't until Alexander Cummings invented the S-trap in 1775, a simple curve in the pipe that used standing water to block sewer gases from coming back up, that the modern toilet became livable. Without that tiny curve of water, our houses would smell like the bowels of a city sewer. By the Victorian era, the toilet wars began. Men like Thomas Crapper, who didn't invent the toilet but certainly perfected and marketed it, turned the water closet into a status symbol.
They began to craft toilets out of beautiful hand-painted porcelain, turning a shameful necessity into a piece of art. But as the West became obsessed with paper, moving from old newspapers and corn cobs to the first commercial toilet paper in 1857, the East was moving in a different direction. In Japan, the washlet revolutionized the game, realizing that water is more hygienic than dry paper, a concept the Romans actually understood 2,000 years ago. Despite the communal sponge, they integrated the bidet into the toilet itself. Today, a high-end toilet can warm your seat, play music to hide embarrassing noises, and use a precision-guided stream of water to leave you cleaner than a Victorian gentleman could ever imagine. We have moved from the sponge on a stick to the smart throne. We have spent thousands of years trying to hide, flush, or perfume away the most basic human function. The history of the toilet is the history of our attempt to separate our civilized selves from our biological reality. We have finally succeeded in making the process invisible, all thanks to a few curved pipes and a lot of porcelain.
As we entered the 20th century, the discovery of germ theory changed hygiene from a social chore into a life-or-death battle. Once Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved that invisible bugs were the cause of disease, the world went into a collective panic. Cleanliness was no longer about getting the mud off your boots. It was about an invisible war against a foe you couldn't see. This led to the era of total sanitation. By the 1950s, the clean home was marketed as a fortress. This was the birth of the antibacterial age. We didn't just want soap. We wanted chemicals that could kill 99.9% of everything. We started putting triclosan and other powerful antimicrobials in everything from hand soap to plastic cutting boards and even children's toys. We weren't just washing, we were sterilizing our lives. But this obsession created a new, modern irony, the hygiene hypothesis. Scientists began to notice that children raised in ultra-clean, sterile environments were actually getting sicker, suffering from higher rates of asthma, allergies, and autoimmune disorders than children raised on farms or in dirtier conditions. By killing every bad germ, we were also killing the good ones that train our immune systems. We had spent 4,000 years trying to get clean, only to find out that being too clean might be dangerous.
Imagine walking through a crowded city street where the air doesn't smell like car exhaust, but like rotting meat, open sewage, and the concentrated musk of thousands of bodies that haven't touched soapy water in months. We live in an era of pressurized hot showers and antibacterial gels, but for 99% of human history, clean was a luxury, a ritual, or sometimes a deadly sin. From Roman social clubs built over steaming water to medieval kings who believed bathing would open their pores to the Black Death, the story of how we stayed clean is a wild, stomach-turning journey through time. You might want to hold your breath. Things are about to get messy. In the modern West, bathing is a private, almost solitary act. We lock the door, turn on the tap, and scrub away the day in silence. But if you were to step back 2,000 years into the heart of the Roman Empire, you would find that cleaning your body was the ultimate public spectacle. For the Romans, hygiene wasn't just about health, it was the cornerstone of civilization itself. To be Roman was to be clean, and to be clean, you had to go to the thermae. The Roman bathhouse was a massive, marble-clad complex that functioned as a gym, a mall, a library, and a spa, all rolled into one. However, the way they actually removed dirt from their skin would be unrecognizable and frankly terrifying to a modern American. They didn't have Irish Spring or Dove's soap. Instead, they used oil and a blade. When a Roman citizen entered the bath, they would first strip down in the apodestrium, the changing room, and head to the palestra to work up a sweat through wrestling or ball games.
Once they were glistening with sweat and coated in the dust of the arena, an attendant would slather their entire body in olive oil. Then came the strigil. This was a curved, blunt metal tool used to scrape the skin. The attendant would drag the metal blade across the person's limbs, peeling off a thick gray paste of oil, dead skin cells, and sweat. This body sludge was so highly regarded that it was sometimes collected in vials and sold to fans of famous gladiators as a medicinal ointment or a cosmetic. After the scraping, the bather would move through a series of rooms with varying temperatures. First was the tepidarium, a warm room to acclimate the body. Then came the calidarium, a room so hot and steamy it functioned like a modern sauna, heated by an ingenious underground system called a hypocaust, where slaves stoked massive fires beneath the floorboards. Finally, to close the pores and shock the system, the bather would plunge into the frigidarium, a pool of bracingly cold water. But don't be fooled by the marble and the steam. These public baths were often biological ticking bombs. The water in the pools was rarely changed, and there was no chlorine to kill bacteria. If you had an open wound or a skin infection, you jumped into the same stagnant water as everyone else. A Roman physician named Celsus once warned that the baths were the worst place for someone with a fresh injury, as the foulness of the water could lead to gangrene. Moreover, the Romans had a peculiar way of handling wiping in the public latrines connected to these baths. Instead of toilet paper, they used a tersorium, a natural sponge tied to a wooden stick. The catch? It was shared. Between uses, the sponge sat in a bucket of high salt water or vinegar. It was the peak of ancient communal living, where even the most private acts of hygiene were shared with the person sitting right next to you. This era set a high bar for cleanliness, but as the empire crumbled, so did the infrastructure for the world's most famous bathers, leading humanity into a much darker, much smellier age.
As the Roman Empire collapsed, so did the aqueducts and the complex plumbing that fed the great bathhouses. Across Europe, the shimmering marble pools fell into ruin, and a new, darker era of hygiene emerged, one shaped by religious fervor and a terrifying misunderstanding of how the human body worked. For the medieval person, being too clean wasn't just a waste of time, it was a danger to the soul and a threat to the body. During the Middle Ages, the Christian Church began to associate excessive bathing with vanity and sinful luxury. While many people still washed their faces and hands daily, the idea of a full body soak became suspicious. Some of the most holy figures in society were those who practiced asceticism, the total rejection of bodily comforts. There are historical accounts of monks and saints who boasted that water had never touched their feet in decades, believing that the odor of sanctity, the smell of a body that had never been washed, was a sign of spiritual purity. To them, the dirtier the body, the cleaner the soul. However, the real turning point in human hygiene history came with the arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century. As the plague decimated Europe, the most learned doctors of the time were desperate for an explanation. They concluded that the disease was caused by miasma, bad air. They believed that hot water was a silent killer because it opened the pores of the skin. Once the pores were open, they reasoned, the poisonous air of the plague could seep directly into the internal organs and kill you. This sparked a widespread water phobia that lasted for centuries. From the late Middle Ages through the Renaissance, people of all classes, from peasants to kings, began to avoid full-body immersion like it was a death sentence. Instead of washing away sweat, people began to believe that a layer of natural grease and dirt actually protected the body by sealing the pores against disease. So how did they manage the smell? The answer was linen. The medieval and Renaissance solution to hygiene was the white shirt. It was believed that linen had a magnetic quality that could draw out sweat and impurities from the skin. If you were wealthy, you changed your linen shirt every day.
You didn't wash your body, you simply changed the fabric that touched it. If your shirt looked white and crisp, you were considered clean, even if the skin underneath hadn't seen water in a year. For the common folk who couldn't afford a wardrobe of fine linen, life was significantly riper. They lived in small, windowless huts shared with livestock. In the winter, families huddled together for warmth, their bodies coated in layers of wool and animal fat to keep out the cold. Soap existed, made from wood ash and rendered animal fat, tallow, but it was harsh, caustic, and used primarily for laundry or cleaning tools, not for sensitive skin. To combat the overwhelming sense of daily life, people turned to dry washing. They would use a coarse cloth to rub their skin vigorously, hoping to scrape off the crust of sweat. To mask the scent of decay and unwashed hair, the wealthy used pomanders, small decorative balls filled with perfumes, spices, and dried flowers, which they held to their noses when walking through crowds. They weren't cleaning themselves, they were simply creating a private bubble of fragrance to drown out the reality of a world that stank of unwashed humanity. This era created a paradox. The more civilized Europe claimed to be, the more it feared the very water that could keep it clean. It was a time when a king might own a dozen palaces, but not a single bathtub, setting the stage for the most famously fragrant courts in human history.
If you think the peasants had it bad, the royal courts of the 17th and 18th centuries were a whole different level of sensory assault. This was the era of the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, and the height of European aristocracy. From the outside, it was a world of breathtaking silk, powdered wigs, and gold-leafed palaces. But underneath the velvet, the reality was truly stomach-turning. In the halls of Versailles, the most powerful people in the world were living in conditions that would make a modern-day landfill seem hygienic. The water phobia we discussed in the last chapter reached its absolute peak during this time. King Louis XIV is famously reported to have taken only 3 full baths in his entire life, and even then, he reportedly hated every second of it, claiming the water gave him a headache. His contemporary, Queen Isabella of Castile, once bragged that she had only bathed twice, on the day she was born and the day she got married. To these monarchs, water was an enemy to be avoided at all costs. Since they weren't washing, the smell of the royal court was legendary. Imagine hundreds of aristocrats packed into a palace with no indoor plumbing and a deep-seated fear of soap. To handle the stench, the French court became the world capital of perfume. But they weren't using perfume to smell nice, they were using it as a chemical weapon to drown out the scent of rotting teeth, sweat-soaked wool, and skin conditions. They doused themselves in heavy, musky scents like civet and ambergris, which is essentially aged whale vomit, because these strong odors were the only things powerful enough to cut through the human musk. Then there was the hair. This was the age of the towering, elaborate wig. These wigs were made of human or horse hair and were rarely, if ever, cleaned. To keep them styled and white, they were slathered in animal fat, lard, and coated in flour or starch. This made the wigs a literal feast for vermin. It was common for aristocrats to suffer from wig lice, and some historical accounts even mention mice nesting inside the massive hair structures of noblewomen. To deal with the constant itching, the wealthy carried scratching sticks, long, elegant rods made of ivory or silver that they could slide under the wig to scratch their bloody, irritated scalps during dinner parties. But the hygiene crisis wasn't just on their bodies, it was in their living spaces. Versailles, the most beautiful palace in the world, did not have public toilets. When nature called, courtiers would often simply find a quiet corner, a staircase, or a space behind a curtain to do their business. The hallways frequently smelled of urine and feces, which stayed there until a servant eventually scrubbed it away. For more formal moments, they used commode chairs or chamber pots, which were often emptied right out the window into the gardens below.
Skincare during this time was equally disastrous. Because they didn't wash, many people suffered from smallpox scars and rashes. To hide these, they applied paints and powders made of lead and arsenic. This white makeup gave them a ghostly, regal look, but it was literally eating their skin away, leading to more sores, which required more lead makeup to cover. They also used patches, small pieces of black silk or velvet cut into shapes like hearts or moons, to hide particularly nasty blemishes or syphilitic sores. By the end of the 18th century, the gilded filth had become unsustainable. The aristocracy was literally rotting under its own finery. It took a massive shift in scientific understanding and a few brave pioneers who dared to suggest that water might actually be good for you, to break the cycle of stench. But before we get to the era of the modern shower, we have to look at how the common people handled their business in the growing, crowded cities of the Industrial Revolution.
As the 1800s dawned, the world began to shift. The quiet, rural life of the Middle Ages was replaced by the clanging machinery and thick coal smoke of the Industrial Revolution. This era brought about a hygiene crisis unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Cities like London, New York, and Manchester exploded in population, but their infrastructure was stuck in the Dark Ages. Millions of people were packed into cramped tenements, and for the working class, cleaning the body became a battle against an environment that was actively trying to keep them filthy. In the mid-19th century, the water phobia of the previous century was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a new, terrifying reality, the Great Stink. With no modern sewer systems, human waste was often dumped into the same rivers that provided drinking and washing water. In London, the River Thames became a thick black sludge of offal and excrement. For a factory worker, a bath often meant wiping oneself down with a rag dipped in water that was likely contaminated with cholera or typhoid. However, this era also saw the birth of the greatest weapon in the history of hygiene, the mass-produced bar of soap. Before this, soap was a luxury item, heavily taxed and made at home using caustic lye and smelly animal fats that could practically peel the skin off a human being. But in the 1800s, chemists discovered how to use vegetable oils and glycerin to create something gentler. Brands like Pears and Ivory began to market soap not just as a tool for laundry, but as a necessity for civilization. Advertising in the US and UK began to weaponize shame. They told the public that cleanliness is next to godliness. If you were dirty, you were seen as morally corrupt or uncivilized. This was the era where the sponge bath became the daily ritual for the middle class. Since most homes still lacked indoor plumbing or water heaters, a full bath required hauling dozens of buckets of water from a communal pump, heating them over a coal stove, and pouring them into a tin tub in the middle of the kitchen. Because this was so much labor, the family bath was a common tradition. The father would bathe first, followed by the mother, then the children, all using the same increasingly gray, soapy, and cold water. For those who couldn't afford a tub, the public washhouse became the savior of the poor. These were massive municipal buildings where, for a few pennies, a worker could get a small stall with a tub of hot water and a piece of soap. It was the first time in history that the average person had access to pressurized, heated water. But even as soap became common, the way people cleaned their hair remained primitive. Shampoos didn't exist in a bottle. People used the same harsh bar of soap on their hair as they did on their floors. This left the hair dull, waxy, and brittle. To fix this, women would rinse their hair with vinegar or lemon juice to cut through the soap scum, a practice that left them smelling like a salad, but finally free of the lice-ridden grease of the wig era. The late 1800s also saw the invention of the first modern shower. Early versions were terrifying contraptions called the velo shower, which required the user to pump a set of pedals like a bicycle to spray water over their head.
Others were rain baths used in military barracks to clean soldiers as quickly as possible. These inventions weren't about relaxation, they were about efficiency and the newfound obsession with germ theory. Scientists like Louis Pasteur had finally proven that it wasn't bad air that made people sick, it was invisible microbes. Suddenly, washing your hands wasn't just about looking good for dinner, it was a matter of life and death.
As the 1900s rolled in, the concept of the bathroom underwent a radical transformation. Up until this point, the bathroom wasn't a room at all. It was a collection of portable items, a washstand in the bedroom, a tin tub in the kitchen, and a wooden shack, the outhouse, in the backyard. But as the 20th century dawned, the American home was redesigned around a new, sparkling centerpiece, the fixed porcelain bathtub. The 1920s and 30s saw a massive boom in indoor plumbing. For the first time, water didn't have to be hauled, it was summoned with the turn of a handle. This changed the psychology of hygiene forever. When water became effortless, the expectation for cleanliness skyrocketed. Being clean was no longer a weekly goal, it became a daily requirement. This shift was fueled by a relentless new force, the American advertising industry. After World War I, soap companies realized they could sell more products by inventing new social diseases. In the 1920s, the term body odor, BO, was popularized by a marketing campaign for Lifebuoy soap. Before this, smelling like a human being was just life. But advertisers convinced the public that the subtle scent of sweat was a social sin that would cost them their jobs, their friends, and their chances at marriage. They did the same thing with halitosis, bad breath, taking an obscure medical term and turning it into a terrifying social phobia to sell Listerine. With the arrival of the 1950s, the golden age of hygiene began. This was the era of the daily morning shower. The shower, once a crude military or gym fixture, was marketed as the ultimate way to start a productive day. It was fast, it was invigorating, and it was modern. This led to the invention of specialized liquids that we take for granted today. In 1927, the first synthetic liquid shampoo was introduced. Before this, using bar soap on hair left it feeling like straw. The new detergents made hair soft, shiny, and most importantly, smelling like herbal essences rather than lye or vinegar. Deodorants also evolved from messy pastes containing aluminum and zinc to the convenient roll-on and aerosol sprays of the 1960s. We moved from masking smells with heavy perfumes, like the kings of old, to chemically blocking our sweat glands entirely. We became the most sterilized generation in human history. But as we reached the 21st century, the pendulum began to swing back. Today, we are seeing a no-poo movement, people ditching shampoo, and a rise in probiotic skincare. Modern scientists are starting to realize that the medieval people might have had a tiny point. Our skin has a microbiome, a layer of healthy bacteria that protects us. By scrubbing ourselves with harsh antibacterial soaps every 24 hours, we might be killing the very germs that keep our skin healthy. From the oil-scraping blades of Rome to the lead-painted faces of Versailles and the pressurized hot showers of today, the story of hygiene is really the story of how we see ourselves. We have gone from fearing water as a bringer of death to worshiping it as a daily ritual of rebirth. We are finally clean, but we had to walk through a lot of mud, grease, and holy stench to get here. By the mid-20th century, the United States had become the world leader in extreme cleanliness. The 1950s and 60s didn't just bring the daily shower, they brought an era of chemical warfare against our own bodies. This was the birth of the antibacterial era. It wasn't enough to just wash away dirt anymore. We had to annihilate every single microbe on our skin. Advertisements portrayed germs as tiny, invisible monsters waiting to destroy your family, and the only solution was a cabinet full of specialized chemicals. This was the period where the medicine cabinet became a staple of the American home.
We invented specific soaps for the face, different soaps for the body, creams for the elbows, and highly scented sprays for everywhere else. For the first time in history, humans began to smell like things that didn't exist in nature: cool breeze, Arctic blast, and midnight rain. We had successfully scrubbed away the scent of being human. However, as we moved into the 2000s, a strange thing happened. Science began to catch up with our obsession, and the results were surprising. Doctors started noticing a massive rise in allergies, eczema, and autoimmune diseases. They called it the hygiene hypothesis. The theory was simple: we had become too clean. By living in sterilized environments and scrubbing our skin with harsh detergents every morning, we weren't giving our immune systems anything to train against. Our bodies were becoming bored and started attacking harmless things like peanuts or pollen. This led to the skin microbiome revolution of the current decade. Modern researchers discovered that the average human body is home to trillions of bacteria, and most of them are actually our friends. They produce natural antibiotics and keep our skin's pH balanced. Suddenly, the medieval idea that we have a protective layer on our skin didn't seem so crazy anymore. Today, the no-poo movement, where people stop using shampoo entirely to let their hair's natural oils take over, has millions of followers. High-end beauty brands are now selling probiotic spray, which is essentially bottled bacteria that you spray on your body after a shower to replace what the soap killed. We have come full circle, from the Romans who scraped their skin with oil, to the Victorians who feared a single drop of water, to a modern society that is paying money to put good dirt back onto their sterilized skin. Looking back at this 2,000-year journey, one thing is clear: hygiene has never been just about health. It's about status, religion, and fear. Whether it was a Roman senator in a steam room, a French king doused in whale vomit perfume, or a modern teenager using 7 different types of charcoal face scrub, we have always been obsessed with the boundaries of our own bodies. We have conquered the great stink of the past, but in our quest for perfection, we are still trying to figure out what it actually means to be clean. The next time you step into a hot, pressurized shower and reach for that bottle of scented body wash, remember, you are participating in a luxury that your ancestors would have considered a miracle or a death sentence.
While the rest of the body was being scrubbed, scraped, or doused in perfume, there was one area that remained a literal cesspool of decay for most of human history: the mouth. Today, a bright white smile is the ultimate American status symbol. But for thousands of years, the inside of the human mouth was a dark, painful, and often deadly place. If you think modern dental bills are scary, the hygiene practices of our ancestors will make your skin crawl. In ancient Rome, they understood that teeth needed to be cleaned, but their methods were unconventional. To whiten their teeth and freshen their breath, Romans used bottled lightning, also known as human urine. Because urine breaks down into ammonia, it was a highly effective cleaning agent. In fact, it was so popular that the Emperor Nero had to put a tax on it. People would gargle with aged urine to bleach their teeth, a practice that actually worked, but left a scent that not even a Roman bath could fully mask. As we moved into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, things took a turn for the worse. As sugar began to arrive in Europe from the New World, it became the ultimate luxury. Queen Elizabeth I of England was so fond of sugar that her teeth famously turned black from rot. Because she was the fashion icon of her day, some of her ladies-in-waiting actually blackened their own healthy teeth with soot just to look like the Queen. It was the only time in history where cavities were a fashion statement. When the pain of a rotted tooth became too much to bear, you didn't go to a dentist. Dentists didn't exist. You went to the barber surgeon. The same man who cut your hair and trimmed your beard would also pull your teeth. Usually this happened in a public square with no anesthesia. The barber would use a tool called a dental pelican, a terrifying metal claw, to wrench the tooth from the jaw.
To drown out the screams of the patient, the barber often had a group of musicians playing loud music outside the shop. For those who wanted to avoid the pelican, early toothbrushes were invented, but they weren't the soft nylon we use today. They were chew sticks, twigs from trees with natural antiseptic properties.